For our talk today, we're speaking about opaque tools. And for us, it's really a question that we're dealing with in our practice. The tools that we're using every day, they bring with them a lot of tradition, but also tradition. They are manufactured in specific ways. And for us, it's really important to take a look at how this all comes together. First of all, let us briefly talk about what we understand by opacity or opaqueness in that case. So this is a diagram that we put together to illustrate what we mean by that. When we were still in the physical world, so with method printing, we were interfering with physical objects to manipulate our layouts, to put them together on a galley, manipulated really physical letters. So that's where the name font, for example, comes from. But then also with the introduction of photo typesetting, there is this layer. So there's a machine that has been between us and our layouts to produce the visual output. So we're not operating with physical objects anymore, but we're operating with a machine that we use to produce our layout. And this is what we see on the right. So a layer that has become between us, so the typesetting, the layout, and the physical world. And this layer got even denser with the introduction of digital typesetting, because then we're not interfering with a machine anymore, but the machine does the layout for us, more or less.
So to approach this question, we try to deconstruct the opaqueness by looking at details like how the text box works. What are its inner logics we don't necessarily think about or that we overlook in our daily practices. There are small details, but we think they're revealing and further understanding our relationship to the tools we use every day as designers. So not coding the software or the output that we're trying to make directly is more comfortable, and maybe it's so much more comfortable that we kind of end up building a passive relationship to the tools that we use. And so here what we're seeing is just a regular text box in the layout software, and there's some words that could actually fit in the text box, but the engineering of the text box will take decisions on which words to where to make line breaks. And we're questioning the fact that we don't necessarily have access to the logic behind and the engineering of how the software makes these choices. Another example is by comparing how a justified text is set in a layout software and then on the web. So usually the space, the glyph space is transparent, but here we highlighted it so we can see how it behaves on the two surfaces. So on the layout software, the space will be next to the word, and then the space that it needs to make the line all the way, take over the width of the column is meant to be on the left of the space and calculated this way. And then on the web, the space is actually on the center, and then the calculated space going both ways. And that's another element that maybe if you don't scratch the surface, you don't necessarily understand how the software is rendered typography. And so the current state of typesetting softwares rarely encourage us to have more of a creative approach or a creative relationship to the tool we use, and to ask ourselves, what if my tool could do this or it could do that? Here we see an example of a simple program where you draw lines and then the plotter machine will reproduce those lines. And so we think it's crucial to have in the tools we use this possibility of asking ourselves, what if it could do this, or if it could do that, and have a more active relationship to our softwares.
Okay, to really understand what is actually happening, we also have to take a look at how we interact with computers, with the machines that we're using to produce designs. And one dominant paradigm of interacting with the computer is WYSIWYG. That has been since the advent of typesetting software, the dominant paradigm of interacting with design. So WYSIWYG is short for what you see is what you get. So you directly work within the design that you then use to print a book, put wherever. And yeah, that's how you interact with it. And this environment has brought with it a lot of history from the past. So for example, we're still talking about leading. We're still talking about points, although there are not really points or leading inside our computer, but it's a metaphor that we are using to interact with it.
And so in the WYSIWYG environment, my hand behaves the same way whether I'm manipulating the canvas or the pen. So in the physical world, all of these objects I'm manipulating have physical limits. On the computer, it's blended together. And whether I'm using one tool or the other, I'm actually doing the same gestures with my hands. And we also see that the WYSIWYG environment often references tools that exist in the physical world, like the eraser or the pen. And the wondering what could happen if instead of referencing physical tools, we imagine what comes next by referencing tools that are actually made on the computer. And so the same diagram that we saw earlier, we think what creates even more opaqueness is that not only the computer kind of creates a layer between the designer and the design output, but the interface and the typesetting kind of fusion together, like we can see on the right side.
Yeah, so this notion is really important, that the design becomes one with the tools that we're using to manipulate them. Okay, taking a look at the next mode of interacting with our computers. And that could be, for example, by means of code. What we did to talk about this is we talked about little outcomes. Often they come from like basic typography school books. So this is what you probably hear in Typography 101, that you have to put like a certain amount of words, one line, 6 to 10 mostly. But what does that actually mean? So liberating designs from a notion of a text box, for example. So thinking the line from a word count and not from a text box standpoint. And this is something that probably would be or take a lot of time to reproduce in layered software, but you could pretty easily do that in a code editor and interacting with code. So what we see here is like a line, and then there's 5 words, 6 words, and so on. Moving on to the next example. So here, when we introduce like a notion of a text box that we can manipulate with the slider to manipulate the text width, we were taking a look at the rag of a text that we can see on the right. And we were thinking about logics that we normally use when we typeset text. So we named that Swiss mode, which tries to produce long lines, short lines, long line, short line, and then tries to fill the line, but really goes until the end of the line. Nothing more logic than this logic. Then the other thing that we tried to think about was this Dutch mode, where we can interfere a bit with the text box length. So it tries to balance this ragged edge of the text a little bit more. So you can decide if you want to put in a little bit more or a little bit less. And that's the gray line that we're seeing towards the end of the video.
And we're inspired by the work of Alan Kay, who's the pioneer in human computer interaction research. And one thing we thought was really interesting is that he pinpointed that the way younger children think, like maybe from 5 to 10, for instance, he asked them to think of how they would describe a circle. And their way of thinking is much more hands-on and practical, and this translates really well into coding. And then when he worked with teenagers or adults, they have access to abstract thoughts and math. And actually, those thoughts become harder to translate into code or maybe more confusing. So we think it's interesting to think of code as we see here on the right, Joseph Albers working at Yale in the 70s, I think, of really trying to think of it as a material that you could experiment with and move around and kind of play with rather than something that's strictly logical or mathematical.
Yeah, and because we all love diagrams, we once again put that into one to visualize what we or how we see this interaction with software, or in what way it is actually limiting to work within one given design software. And that's the purple circle that you see in the middle. So that is the imaginary possibilities offered by one given tool. Of course, we're always able to write little plugins, stuff like that, to extend that space, but we're always confined within what is actually possible or doable within that software. And for us, in the current state, means of code could be one way of actually extending that space and doing things that probably go beyond of what is possible within one software.
And so how could typesetting evolve if the software that we use were developed from cross-cultural and notable viewpoints? The current space that we're dealing with is like offered by mainstream layout software, and it's more of a linear approach. So there's a central conceptor that engineers the software. We don't necessarily have access to the logics of how it works, as we were saying at the beginning. Then this is the typesetting tool that we use, and then the output files that it creates are proprietary. So we can't share them in different spaces. It stays between this space and can only be used within this software. And then us as designers, we kind of are at the end of the line using the product, but can't really interact with the other elements that come before us. So what could a different approach to layout software be? For instance, the letter box is a direct translation of a movable type into programming, and it's in use since the start of computers, the first text editors. And now that fonts are free from the physical constraints or the simulation of a physical space, you will still need to build fonts using the text box.
Yeah, to take a look at what that could look like. So, for example, this would be more of like a mental model that we have of a letter, which is probably not put within one box, but liberated from the text box. And then we could have like the arrows going into all sorts of directions, which is to symbolize that obviously there are writing directions and stuff like that. And yeah, it's just for us a way to think about what could actually be possible if we tried to think letters without their corresponding boxes. So you could not only imagine text going from left to right, top to bottom, right to left, but probably also going into three-dimensional space and stuff like that. So one example from the real world, where this box is kind of working. We've seen it, I think, in the example of Paul this morning also. Here in the letterboxes I used and repositioned to give the impression of the connected script, but it's more of a workaround, I'd say, to make something possible that was probably not, thought of in advance or made for this in advance. Whereas the mental model of what it actually could look like is probably more something that we see on the right.
So we were thinking, how could we open up? What could be ways to open up this space and have it less centered on just one way of thinking? It could be maybe to create layout files that are open and then can be used from different softwares. And so if we did this, then we'd have to kind of agree on standards on how typography is engineered and rendered in different softwares.
Yeah, and what would that actually mean or look like in the real world? So if we remember once more the monolinear diagram with one central actor that creates a layout software and then just puts out one software that then is used to do layout. We imagine it to be more something like this, where the layout file and the actual file structure are opened, and we could have many different softwares that we could use to manipulate those files. So something more towards an active community that is developing the software, saying what they want and how they want it developed. And but in order for that to happen, probably some things are needed.
So one challenge that we imagine here is the book Details in Typography by Joshua Haymann, where micro typography and spacing is crucial to the whole book and his arguments. And we were wondering, so if this book file was made with one layout software and then open on the other one, and the engineering of rendering the type maybe have small differences. Those small differences in the case of this book would be big differences. We can see it here. Imagine just the justification of a text may be engineered slightly differently between two softwares and what would happen to the design file. And we think this opens up a question of whether as designers we could survive without fixed designs. So we looked at art history to think about this. And so from the left, we have one of a kind arts of work that are unique and exist in just one instance in one place. And that what makes it so cherished and also so well known. And then in the evolution of art history, then in some artworks, the idea of the work becomes more important, and the object itself is important too, but it could maybe be replaceable and the artwork still be understood.
Yeah, so we could imagine that probably like a musical score, for example, where it's not about one specific interpretation, but it's more about the idea or the rules or the instructions that are given to then perform a specific rendition. Yeah, and with that, I think we are 19 minutes in. So for us, this is really an opportunity to open like a discussion, because that is not something that can happen from one or two or 10 persons alone, but that is really something that needs to be discussed in a community and the broadest community possible.
And we're asking ourselves, we see that in the design economy, there's more and more jobs in the tech sector. And in this environment, the idea of a design that's constantly being redone and being iterative and so not fixed is very important idea. and at the same time, as more classical designers who for which the conception of the design or the ideas of the design are really important, how could we find ways to find a good balance between working with more flexible environment and yet still use design ideas or a design methodology or working with materials, then have them balance each other.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, so really interesting what you've been talking about. I think it's like blowing my mind a little bit. If we're to break out of, like theme design, for example, the software that I use on a day-to-day basis, if we were to get some quick effects organizations, would it be useful to implement it at a much younger age in order to know it even further? So when children learn to write, they're eventually they're not even ready to the bright 30s and join it up anymore, because that's changed already compared to when we grew up. So at the moment, there's probably still using Word and the technologies like that. So if typesetting was introduced during coding at a younger age, where would that be designed, like 10 years on from, so taught completely differently to how they're not taught the convention that we're taught. So is that like a place that could be implemented for things to change further along the market? Or is that a waste of time?
Hopefully, I think that would be great, actually, to my mind. But yeah, and I'd say in order for that to happen, it would like demand a massive rethinking of a lot of things that we're just trained to or used to. Yeah, but I actually haven't thought about that. We were more like thinking it from that standpoint that in universities, mostly one layout software is taught. And what that could actually mean if we break that up. Because it's like a self-repeating prophecy where if you teach one software, then there's the industry standard, which then gets taught again. And yeah, so I think, yeah, I haven't thought about it, but yeah, that would be great. Yeah.
I agree. Your talk is brilliant. Really, really interesting. And one of the things about teaching within design is that it's nearly impossible, in my experience, to get students to use it as an investigative tool, because they have no access to the components within it. They've just got as the opaque interface. And so they end up doing good, bad, or indifferent production jobs rather than using it as a tool to explore what would happen if they change the parameters of things. So that's actually quite difficult to set up. But you see down there, look, it says tech users group. What you almost seem to be implying is reinventing a system like tech, but with some kind of visual rather than code-based interface. Is that so that you've got access to the components for composition system like the justification engine and the scaling engine and so on and so forth, but that these are are you thinking of these as sort of modular things that you can dip into and dip out of? I'm pretty on the spot there.
Yeah, I think it could be visual or code-based. I think what's important is to find ways for the user to be critical, have a critical relationship to the tool, but I
managed once to write an InDesign document which responds to what you type. This is what I was telling you about last night. I didn't have time to do it. Okay. So as you type in, this text is 10 on 14 point, the text becomes 10 or 14 points.
Mhm.
And I found this quite useful because it's disconcerting when the type changes size or changes color as a result of what you're typing. But it does make you think about how you're asking. I was taught to specify the type. If you think back to Catherine's talk and her series of frameworks for thinking about design, I grew up in that, not quite post-war, but a bit, but 60s specifying for design. I wrote down, please set this in 9 on 12 point universe across 18 points. And my little fidgeted InDesign document was trying to get students to think in the same way. What happens if I think about what I want and then see what it looks like? But I don't just rely on clicking down the menu.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think once we arrive at a point where we are able to open up a file in different software, it could be possible to, or at least thinkable, to have multiple versions of editing the very same file. So WYSIWYG for some people might very well be the way to interact with their designs, but for others it might not. So yeah, in preparation for this talk, we tried to write PDF files ourselves, which is very well possible because it is an open standard, but it's so rigid and not meant to, it's not meant to be written, but produced by means of, software that, I don't know. I think that's what we were hinting at with the chapter on open standard files, which you could then probably allow being interacted with in multiple ways. A bit like HTML files that you could write by hand. You could use visual editors, manipulate this directly in the browser. I think things like that could be thinkable.
You're looking at me funny. I'm glad that you've survived the trauma of your seminar at Reading, because you did a seminar here. It's at the bottom time from that. Your talk was fascinating. It took me about 10, 15 years ago when Webfont first came out. There was this brief period when we thought we could explain to web designers the richness of typographic challenges. That didn't happen because a lot of the way that content was displayed on the web was primarily left to right, fairly simple scripts, and nothing interesting happened then. Now we have hacks based on CSS and JavaScript. However, there is, and I don't think what you say will happen, because for most of us, these tools that we don't want to use very much or be tied to or paying license for are sort of good enough and can get the job done. And your next job at a German institution will be tied to you teaching the same things, and we're talking about infrastructure. But in China, which is beginning to recognize that diversity might not be a terrible thing, that immediately means scripts in multiple directions. There's a long history of Chinese, forward, left to right, right to left, and top to bottom. They are beginning to accommodate Mongolian, which is vertical, plus other scripts that have different complexities. And there's a younger generation of people who are seeing this as a mission, and they don't have the access to the tools that maybe you have and the ease of licensing these, say, US-based tools. So there's it's not so easy to just keep on doing things. So what you're saying is absolutely fine. I don't think it will happen in Europe. I think at some point from East, where people are faced with problems where it's not so easy to keep doing that, because try doing Mongolian in design, right? And something will come out from people who really have a need to solve these much more complex typographic problems. So if you speak to Japanese people who are, I don't know, below 35, that's the fun generation, who have technical skills and also the best interest in doing something. A lot of what you're talking about is a matter of discussion there. and they have no attachment to the print medium that we have, because it's everything about a large font. So I think yes, but the least.
Yeah, even better, I'd say.
Yeah.
Great.
Also, da liegt doch nicht. Da fehlt so eine Bezogenheit.
Ja. Okay, thanks.